Hi everyone, hello, welcome back to one more interview in the program NexGenLead. Today I have the pleasure to be with Arnold that will um, tell us a bit about his experience using the same framework that we are using for this program NexGenLead, which is Carl, the competency assessment for responsible leadership. But first, Arnold, can you share a bit with us about you, your career, and your passion, maybe, on sustainability and leadership?
Thank you, Marcelo. And from my side, good day to everybody. I live in South Africa. Just in terms of context, this is where I grew up. This is where I live. This is where I do my work. I am an associate professor of business in society at the University of Stellenbosch Business School, where I've been for the last 10 years. Prior to that, I spent time in parish ministry as a reverend or a theologian. As for the start of my career, I moved on from there to consulting, which included leadership and organizational development, specifically at the time of the transition in South Africa when we became a post-apartheid democratic society, which was a very interesting but also very challenging time. Moved into corporate life where I worked as a human resources executive for a few years. Then returned to my own practice again and eventually ended up at Stellenbosch Business School, where I was very privileged to initiate and work with colleagues on bringing ethics and responsibility and sustainability into management education, specifically executive education, as well as mainstreaming that in the MBA environment. So I think you can summarize from that, but that most of my life has been spent in a passion for developing people, specifically around ethics, responsibility, and sustainability, equipping students and managers in terms of how to do this professionally, as well as in terms of their organizational responsibilities. So I'm happy to be here where I am and happy to be on the interview with you as well.
Thank you very much. So usually the aim of our interview is to share the stories, our stories, personal or professional, on how we implement responsible leadership or which kind of practices we have, and therefore to share new perspectives of what is responsible leadership, what it is not, and which competences can help us to become a responsible leader. So as I mentioned previously, you are implementing the CARL, or the competency assessment on responsible leadership, in your classes. And so I would like to learn more how you are using CARL, what is your experience, and which are the results for now that you have obtained with this.
Certainly, I use it in two areas. From a postgraduate education perspective, specifically at the moment in our postgraduate diploma in leadership development at the business school, where we use it as an instrument for personal reflection. So our students in this program, they are confronted with a very personally transformative learning journey. And we have implemented CAL there specifically at the time in their program when the topic of business in society specifically come to bear. So what I was very much intrigued with during the course of this year, about 75% into the program, how would they use and apply CAL as a framework in terms of integrating their learning, specifically personally so, as well as the commitments that they see with respect to their leadership in their organizations. So knowing that CAL is very useful in terms of learning about yourself, I also think that it is very useful in terms of also applying it to your organizational life and ask yourself, so how do I lead specifically in terms of these 5 categories that Carl is consisting of? Stakeholder relations, ethics and values, self-awareness, systems understanding, and change and innovation. So whereas on the one hand, it helps us in terms of our knowledge, our skills, and our attitude in terms of these 5 categories, it also gives us a lens in terms of how do I actually fare in real and practical circumstances with this. So as one example, I was very impressed by how our students, after 8 months of being into a program, specifically this postgraduate diploma program, how they would become sensitive towards the way in which responsibility and sustainability and ethics, the way in which it is actually situated in their organizational life, as well as confronting them, and how they have become much more aware of stakeholder dynamics, stakeholder realities, seeing their stakeholder environment in a new light, and realizing that the topic of ethics and values are actually really coming about in relationships, and specifically in stakeholder relationships. And from that perspective, how you connect the two. Of course, you also need to have a particular sense of self-awareness in order to know that you are in this relational environment where you are surrounded with internal and external stakeholders as far as your professional and your organizational life is concerned. And hence, when you connect with the topic of values and ethics, how you are confronted with that in these relationships, but then at the same time, not to experience that you are kind of stuck there, but that you can actually turn this around in asking different questions about that, and specifically asking questions about, so how can we move from this awareness to seeing the consequences in terms of attending to these challenges that we have, ethical challenges, challenges of responsible management, challenges of sustainability, whether it might be social or environmental sustainability. And then if I attend to that from that perspective, so what are the leverages for change and making a real impact? So whereas the instrument helps us with kind of assessing where we stand, I like to use the instrument also in terms of reflecting on where I am in terms of my leadership responsibilities and how do I go about the changes that might be needed. Which brings me to the second point, which I think is quite interesting. I also use it in executive education or then for practicing managers in short courses. And in that sense, I particularly use it as a, not necessarily as an instrument for self-assessment. Of course, this is where we start. And in order to use it, you need to know how it works. But I use it for problem solving. So I will, for instance, I will ask practicing managers in executive education programs or senior management development programs to identify an ethical challenge or a challenge of responsibility or sustainability in management, to identify a challenge, to describe the challenge, and then to apply the categories of Carl, and then say, okay, there is no problem that comes without stakeholder connections. So who are the stakeholders around your challenge? And why are they there? What is it that they signal? When you look at ethics and values, we normally would find that stakeholders, when they put up a flag and say there is pain in the system, there is something here that's bothering us, it will normally be something in the space of ethics and values that they find troublesome, that's raising pain for them. And it's important for responsible leaders not to ignore that pain in the system, but to take that serious. We will, for instance, see that companies who end up in reputation exposure in the market, that mostly so in the run-up of their story, there has been a moment, or even more than one moment, where a stakeholder, either an individual or a community or a group of customers or a group of suppliers or a particular supplier, has put up a hand and said, I'm uncomfortable with how you treat me. There is pain in the system. Companies ignore that at their own peril. So having sussed out the stakeholder environment, that gives us a bridge towards, so what are the ethics and values at stake here? But then that same individual also need to say, so where do I stand with respect to this? What is that I become aware of it? Or what do I become aware of in terms of the profiling and the position and situation of the company that I represent or the organization that I represent, because it's not just a company, there are many types of organizations. And then from that self-awareness say, all right, if we neglect this thing and we do not take it up as a challenge, what might be the consequences? Or in the true sense of our responsibility works, in order to bring change at a systemic level, what are the proactive steps that we need to take that will have a positive impact, and to identify those steps proactively, those processes to identify proactively, and then to find in the system a place where I can leverage change. Where is there something that I can start working on to answer to that ethical challenge or to answer to that sustainability issue that needs to be responded to? So let me stop there. I use it therefore in two ways. The one is as a means of reflection, and the other is as a framework for problem solving. And to, in a sense, teach managers a disciplined way of working through a responsibility challenge in a business environment.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing this experience. Yeah, so usually, as I understand the Carl, we would do the test before starting reflecting on responsible leadership, for instance, and then afterwards and see the evolution. And it will also provide us tools or resources to evolve and to go through this journey. Is that the way you implement it? And when you implement it, which kind of outcomes have you seen in those different audiences?
This is incidentally not how I implement it. In the beginning I did, but I realized that the time frame of my engagement with groups around Carl is too short to do that. So in order to do that and implement it right at the beginning, I do think that you need to have quite a few weeks or months in terms of introducing that to a group that I have to go by in terms of working with them through that, and then to be able to do a second assessment after a period of time. So it was just not practical for me to do it like that, and hence I'm using it in the way that I'm using it at the moment. It might be that if I would happen to work with the same group again, let's say somewhere in the future, that we could say, let's bring it back and see where we stand at the moment.
Great. Okay, so there are different ways of using this responsibility leadership assessment.
I would agree, so yes.
And for instance, I'm a student, and I would like to know, for you, what would be the best approach for a student to come to his or her teacher and say, hey, here is this Carl framework. Would you like to implement it? For you, which are the arguments that the student should bring for the teacher in order for the teacher to implement it?
Well, I think all of us like to get some feedback about ourselves. I mean, we have a natural curiosity to start off with there. I also think that Carl, in terms of its composition, it's not about a verdict. It's about generating a certain curiosity. I also think that in terms of the touch points that Carl actually provides, that those touch points are real touch points. In as much as they stand on the legs of good theory, those are real touch points in terms of the challenges of practicing managers and leaders in terms of what they will face in a business environment. And hence, in terms of getting this feedback about yourself, in terms of these well-known modalities around knowledge and skills and attitudes, I think the feedback is valuable, specifically in terms of knowing where do I need to put more focus on, how do I further develop my understanding, how can I develop my skills, and so on. I think the categories, the 5 themes that it's composed of, absolutely fit with that which managers and leaders in real life that they have to deal with. So I think it's a convincing argument. At the same time, I also think, and it's also part of my experience around this, you need a broader conversation in a faculty as a whole amongst faculty colleagues, so that can maybe implemented over a broader spectrum. I think we still need to do some work around that, but maybe that's on the future agenda. But for a student, I think it's absolutely to the point, spot on. Maybe let me tell you this one story. It's not a student story, but it was a surprising story for me. About 3 months ago, I did a workshop in one of our fellow African countries. In Kenya, I work with this across cultures and in a variety of countries, South Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and so. And I was very surprised when in the assessment or the assignment that I gave to the participants in this program, one of the participants wrote back to me and said, I took up the challenge, and not only am I casting my, my problem in terms of the CAL framework as you have requested me to work through an ethical dilemma, I am now requiring my team as well as my board to take it themselves. So they took it upon themselves to go to the website, to fill in the questionnaire, and now they have this as common knowledge amongst them as a group of, as an executive team, as well as at the board level amongst the directors. And they're actually, based on what they experienced with me in class, they're actually practicing it themselves. And it's become a framework for them in their business. So why should students take it? Not only just because of the fact that it is good for them, but because of the fact that they can actually take it further and apply it in their relationships, specifically in organizational life or in professional settings, and spread the good news to other people as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So one thing that I understood also is that the CARL can be used as a team building activity somehow, to ensure that everyone has the same understanding and shares at least a part of a perspective regarding responsible leadership.
Certainly, because it gives a common language and it brings those elements to bear. Stakeholders, ethics and values, self-awareness, which could be an individual self-awareness, but also a collective self-awareness about us as a company or organization, linking it to change, linking it to innovation, and so forth. So it brings a common language, and that common language, I think, is powerful for teams. And my experience is that when we talk about, specifically in the field that I use it, specifically in the ethics and values environment, you need strong relationships in order to promote an ethical and a values-based approach in organizations. And if you can provide a common language to a team, you are so much better off.
Mm-hmm. Right. Is it also a way to start fostering dialogue within a student group? For instance, they have this first framework, they do the test, and then they start debating about this?
I certainly think so. It's not that I have, in terms of debating it, that I have so much personal experience about that or seen that happen. But the moment that you put a particular topic in the middle of that, let's say you put the topic of corruption right in the center of it, or let's say that you put the topic of pollution right in the middle of it, or the topic around, let's say, renewable energies in the middle of that. And you say, okay, so let us look at this topic from the angles of what Carl provides for us. You get a very interesting and I think a very thoughtful conversation. Because as I've said in the beginning, you can't talk about this stuff without connecting it to stakeholders, without connecting it to ethics and values, without connecting, so where do I stand with respect to this? Without connecting it to a systems understanding of what life is all about, because that's the essence of responsible leadership, is that it's not only just responsibility for self, it's responsibility in the context of relationships, but it is also in the context of responsibility for global, systemic and interconnected challenges. And then, of course, once you've worked through that, the natural question that remains, so what do we do about this? So where do we find leverage for change and innovation? So it's not necessarily about debating the framework or the categories of the framework, but once you put something in that framework and say, let's look at this framework from the perspective of the 5 windows, so to speak, that Carl provides for us, you immediately have a very good conversation on your hands.
Great. Thank you very much for this practice exercise that we can do in class then, using this framework.
Yeah. Can I build on that? My experience, Marcelo, with specifically the students that I work with, MBA students as well as practicing managers, is that we go too quickly from problem to solution because of the tendency to be driven by operational efficiency and shortcuts to answers. There are categories of problems in life where we need to ask a few questions in between, having sensed the problem and coming to an implementable answer. And these kind of problems that we find in the area of ethics, responsibility, and sustainability are typical of that. And hence, just that discipline to say, before we shoot for a short-term solution, let's just work through this framework. Hang on a little bit, slow down the conversation. Let's work through this to see whether we can come to a better solution. And trying to assume this as a normal and a disciplined practice, I find very helpful. So instead of shooting from the hip and moving too quickly to a solution, let's just check in with Carl with the 5 categories and eventually arrive at something that might in the end be a much more sustainable answer to a problem.
Professor, usually I ask if people would like to share a main message with the students. For you, I would like to ask you, which main message would you like to send to professors regarding responsible leadership or the implementation of Carl?
I think as educators, whether to students at the undergraduate or postgraduate level, or with practicing leaders and managers already in organizations, we have a duty to equip people with a sense of responsibility for the future. We need to do that in such a way that people have helpful tools that they can use, that they can enter into conversations that are meaningful and make sense, and that they are equipped to bring about those changes that we are going to need for the future. The current generation of leaders and managers that we work with have a very important role to play, specifically in terms of where we find ourselves currently in the midst of a pandemic, but also in the midst of a set of very important, radical sustainable development challenges. And for us as educators, it is important, I think, to equip those that we are working with, connected with a sense of hope and passion, combined with helpful tools in terms of making an impact on the world. That for us would be the responsible thing.
Great. What about a practice that you do daily or monthly that helps you to go towards this responsible leadership attitude? Would like to share one with the students?
Well, I guess when we talk about this, it starts at a very personal level. It starts with realizing that there are very few conversations in life that we are involved with that are not putting this conversation in front of our eyes. Transactions that we participate in, deals that we might be confronted with, consumer practices that we carry out on a daily basis, and so on. So it starts with you as an individual. And combined with that, it starts at home. It starts at home with your family, with those nearest to you. This is the first step, and I think a safe space to actually implement these kind of practices. You've already heard me saying that this is relationally embedded, these kinds of practices. You need people around you, and you need to do it with people around you. The second step, I think, is to realize that we do not need to, and this is my message to students as well, is we do not need permission for this kind of thing. Wherever I am involved in relationships and wherever I might be leading a small group of people, I can do the responsible thing. We can do the elementary things, the things where if you are in middle management or take charge of a small group and their outputs, where you can already bring to bear the normal everyday disciplines that speak to sustainability and responsibility and good decisions. Even if it is as simple and straightforward as saving electricity, go sparingly about water, recycling your stuff. I mean, this is not the full agenda, but you hear what I'm talking about. We don't need permission for these simple things. Do it and influence the people around you, and do it as often as you can, and keep on reminding yourself and stay with the discipline. And then, of course, as we grow through life and our responsibilities become more, and we become really part of important decision-making practices in organizations, this is where we need to be really alert, and where we need to find ways of influencing, speaking our mind, exercising our values, influencing conversations, influence decisions that will eventually not just be beneficial for the organizations that we work in, but also beneficial for stakeholders, for the world, broadly speaking, more so, and so on. So I love the framework of me, we, all of us, as we step from conquering it yourself to start off with, then look at it in terms of your relationships where you might have an influence, and in even growing further in terms of your responsibilities, make it part of organizational life. I think this is how we go about it. It's not always, I think, possible to pinpoint a particular practice. I think it's a mindset. And this mindset embeds itself in your conversations and the decisions and the practices that you are involved with.
Professor Arnold, thank you very much for this talk. I learned a lot. It was really a pleasure. So hope to see you soon, and also in NexGenLead.
Thank you so much, and also all the best with your project, and thank you for involving me in this. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for your time. Bye, everyone.